I came to Cell on a 3-month contract, which was the longest contract I had ever been offered and still short enough that I didn't unpack my second bag. That was how I measured jobs in those days. One bag or two. One bag meant I expected to be moving on before I'd worn through my boot soles. 2 bags meant I thought there was a chance. I had worked 12 postings in 8 years, field clinics, transit hospices, a year on a deepwater salvage platform, 2 years in a refugee processing depot on the outer rim where the patients came in speaking 40 languages and the medical supplies came in speaking none, and I had never once unpacked the second bag. Not because the work was bad. Because I was a human nurse on alien contracts, and humans on alien contracts were always the first to be let go when the institution found a local candidate, and local candidates were always found eventually, and I had stopped being surprised about it somewhere around the 6th posting. I didn't carry bitterness about it. That took energy I needed elsewhere, and I had learned early that the work was the only thing that followed you from posting to posting in a way that was actually useful. Resentment travels poorly. Skills don't. So I came to Cell Palace with one bag on my shoulder and a clear-eyed understanding of what I was, a stopgap. Someone to fill the infirmary's night roster while the regular staff recovered from a season fever that had laid out 3 of the palace's 6 nursing auxiliaries. The contract was specific. Night shifts only. Supply management, wound care, post-procedure monitoring. Nothing complex. The court physicians would handle anything above basic care, and I was not to exceed my scope, and the scope had been described to me in the hearing document, with a thoroughness that made clear exactly what the palace thought of importing a human for the work. I did not mind. I had read harder hearing documents than that. I had also worked under harder scope restrictions, in places where the limitations made less practical sense than they did here, and I had learned that the best response to a small scope was to do everything within it exactly right, every time, without exception. There is a version of invisibility that is simply the result of doing your job quietly and well, and that version is fine with me. It means nobody is complaining. The palace was, I will say it plainly, the most beautiful building I had ever worked in. That probably sounds strange, but when you have spent years in corrugated panel clinics and shipping container wards, beauty registers as its own kind of information. It tells you something about the people who built the place and the people who live in it. And in a medical setting, it tells you something specific about the resources available and the expectations of the people you'll be treating and the gap, sometimes large and sometimes small, between those expectations and the biological reality that no amount of marble can change. The marble floors of the Cell infirmary wing were pale gold, veined with something that caught the light and held it, and the corridor lights ran warm amber at night, so the building never felt cold the way institutions usually do. The ceiling in the main infirmary hall was vaulted and high, and somewhere in the stone there were carved patterns I couldn't quite make out from floor level, but which I sometimes looked up at when I was restocking shelves, trying to see if they were abstract or representational, or something the Vareth didn't bother distinguishing between. The instruments in the prep station were cleaned and returned to their trays with a precision that was genuinely impressive. And the supply inventory, when I first took it over on my second night, was accurate to within a few items. Much better than most institutions I had worked in, where the supply room was either a disaster or maintained with such obsessive rigidity that finding anything in an emergency required institutional memory you either had or didn't. The patients were courtiers and household staff, and occasionally visiting dignitaries who had eaten something that disagreed with their alien digestive systems in ways that varied entertainingly. The court physicians handled the dignitaries and the courtiers above a certain rank. I handled everyone else. I liked everyone else. In my experience, the patients below a certain rank were usually more straightforward. They told you what hurt, they followed the aftercare instructions. They didn't expect the pain to negotiate around their schedule. The institution's invisible population, The people who kept the marble floors polished and the instrument trays clean and the corridors operating were often the best patients, pragmatic, unsentimental, grateful without theatrics. In my first 2 weeks, I treated a head gardener's infected hand, a laundry supervisor's respiratory infection, a kitchen worker's deep grease burn, and a maintenance coordinator's sprained ankle, and all four of them thanked me as they left in the specific way that people who are not usually thanked thank other people who are not usually thanked, with a directness that didn't require elaboration. I had been there 11 days before I saw the Queen. I had not been looking for her. I had been moving a cart of clean dressings from the supply room to the instrument prep station, which was around the corner from the infirmary's secondary corridor, and which required me to pass through a stretch of passage that was technically a through route, but that nobody used at that hour, because it added 30 seconds to any route that went through the main hall, and the palace's staff, in my observation, were highly efficient about routing. The Queen was coming the other way, flanked by 3 attendants, and a physician I recognized as Droveth, the senior consultant, the most distinguished of the palace's 4 staff doctors, a man whose opinion of human medical practitioners I had gauged fairly precisely from our one brief interaction on my second day, in which he had asked me whether I had any formal qualifications, and then not quite listened to my answer. The Queen was taller than I'd expected. I knew that the Vareth were, as a rule, tall. Most of them had a good hand's breadth on an average human, but the Queen carried her height differently than the courtiers I'd seen. The courtiers wore their height the way decorative columns wear height, as a structural feature of their bodies rather than something chosen by what lived inside them. The Queen simply moved as though the space around her had arranged itself to accommodate her, which I supposed, in a palace built for her bloodline across several generations, it had. She had pale silver skin, the shade of birch bark in winter, and her hair was the white of old linen, pinned in a way I didn't know the name of but which looked like it had required considerable effort and considerable skill to achieve. Her eyes, when they briefly angled in my direction as I pressed myself and my dressing cart to the wall to clear the passage, were a deep and settled gray with a faint luminescence at the iris edge, the kind of light that seemed to come from inside the eye rather than reflected off its surface, which I had read about in the species primer but not actually seen up close. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention. The kind of thing that the primer probably described as a subtle non-human marker, and that in person registered as simply the most distinctive feature of an already distinctive face. She did not look at me the way you look at a person. She looked at me the way you register an obstacle successfully avoided, a flicker of notice, a slight adjustment of path, a return to whatever she had been thinking about before the obstacle appeared, and then her gaze moved on, and then she was past, and her attendants were past, and Droveth was past without so much as a nod, and I was standing in the corridor with my dressing cart, and the faint smell of whatever scented oil the attendants used on their formal robes, which was something floral and green that I didn't have a name for. I watched them turn the corner. Then I looked at my dressing cart. Then I wheeled it to the instrument prep station and unloaded it and went back for the second batch. That was the Queen. It was on the 19th day of my posting that I first heard about the shoulder. I heard about it the way I heard about most things in the palace, sideways, through the conversation of people who weren't talking to me but who were talking near me. I had developed, over the years, a reliable technique for gathering information in institutions where I was not considered interesting enough to brief. I kept moving and working, and people who had adjusted to registering my presence as background talked more or less freely in my vicinity. It was not eavesdropping exactly. It was that I was present, and the building's conversations happened around me the way weather happens around a fixed post. I was in the instrument prep station, running the autoclave cycle, when 2 of the junior courtiers came through the corridor at pace, talking low and fast in the clipped Vareth court register that I had learned to parse in my first week, because, It was the register most of the staff used around me when they thought they were being private. It was not difficult to learn. The court register was just standard Varath with a different vowel set and a compressed syntax, and I had spent 2 years in the refugee depot learning to navigate language through structure and rhythm when vocabulary failed me, which was an experience that turned out to be surprisingly transferable. The queen had fallen. Not badly, they said, not a real fall, more a stumble during the morning ceremony when the processional platform had been reset incorrectly by the maintenance staff. She had caught herself on the railing, but the way she had caught herself, with one arm thrown back and the full torsion of her weight on the extended shoulder, had. I stopped listening to the specific words and started listening to the shape of the problem. A shoulder catchfall, arm extended back and outward, sudden torsion with full body weight behind it. I had seen that exact mechanism maybe 40 times. In the field clinic on my third posting, where the patients were construction laborers who fell from scaffolding. On the salvage platform, where equipment slipped in ways that hands tried to arrest and couldn't. In the refugee depot twice, in the processing courtyard where the ground was uneven and people moved too fast on surfaces they didn't know yet. The shoulder is a ball-end socket joint that is, structurally speaking, a compromise between mobility and stability, and the compromise it makes is that mobility wins and stability is the thing you sacrifice when you need to reach far or brace hard. It pops. It has always popped. In every species I have worked with that has a shoulder analogous to the one humans have. In humans, the glenohumeral joint has a socket angled approximately 5 degrees downward from horizontal. Forward falls tend to produce anterior dislocations. Backward catches tend to produce posterior ones. In Varath, and I had learned this from the Alien Anatomy supplement in the Palace's medical reference library, which I had read on my third night, because it seemed like the kind of thing worth knowing. The glenohumeral anatomy has a shallower socket overall and a longer superior glenoid rim. This means Varath shoulders have a greater natural range of motion than human ones. But it also means that when the force exceeds the joint's tolerance, the ball comes out of the cup more readily, and the surrounding musculature, proportionally longer and more powerful than the human equivalent, responds to the displacement with a stronger contractile defense response. All of which is to say, the mechanics are the same, the scale is different, but the principles hold. I finished the autoclave cycle and went to see about restocking the clean dressing shelf on the North Ward. I did not volunteer any thoughts. I was not asked for any thoughts. I was a night shift auxiliary nurse working under a limited scope contract in a palace where 4 staff physicians and a network of consulting specialists existed precisely to handle situations above my level. The scope document had been clear. I knew my place in the building's hierarchy, and my place did not include walking up to the senior consultant and saying that I thought I knew what to do about the Queen's shoulder. Droveth had been called to the Queen's chambers at once. 2 of the other staff physicians had been summoned shortly after. None of this had anything to do with me. I did my shift. I went back to my quarters. I ate a plain meal and sat by the small window that looked out over the eastern palace wall and the grounds beyond it, where the Varath gardeners were still working in the late daylight, moving among plants I couldn't name in rows I couldn't identify the logic of, and I thought, not deliberately, just as the kind of thinking that happens when the hands are occupied and the mind wanders, about Varath glenohumeral anatomy, about the shallower socket, about the stronger contractile response, about the approach that would need to account for both. Then I went to sleep. The next morning, passing the infirmary's secondary corridor on my way to the shift handover, I heard that the reduction had not taken. I did not pause, I did not stop, I kept walking. The next morning I heard that a specialist had been brought in from the Varath Cell Medical Collegium, a bone setter, the most experienced in the region, who had treated 3 previous members of the royal household, and was considered the foremost authority on musculoskeletal injuries of the upper limb in the province. He had traveled 6 hours. His reputation preceded him in the way that decades-built reputations do, with a weight that alters the room when you enter it. He failed too. I heard this from Perth, a Vareth woman on the kitchen staff who brought the infirmary its morning supply of hot water and who had started, in my second week, to say good morning in a way that suggested she meant it. Perth knew everything that happened in the palace. She said the specialist had tried 3 approaches across 2 sessions, and each time the joint had not seeded, and the Queen was now in considerable pain and unable to use the arm, and Droveth was already in contact with a physician from the capital, internationally regarded, trained in 3 different medical traditions, who was traveling to the palace now. "Has anyone tried?" I started. Perth looked at me. Her expression was not unkind. It was the expression of someone who likes you and understands the situation clearly and is gently indicating that understanding. I closed my mouth. "No," I said, "never mind, thank you, Perth." She nodded and handed over the water supply and went. I carried the water to the prep station. I set it on the warming shelf. I stood with my hands on the edge of the shelf for a moment, looking at the amber-lit corridor through the prep station window. At the vaulted ceiling I couldn't quite read, at the polished marble floor that caught the morning light differently from how it caught the night light. And I thought about the contractile response in the Vareth shoulder musculature, and what the correct approach would need to do about it. And I thought about the scope document, and I turned away from the window and went to do my morning rounds. The medical collegium specialist. I played the collegium specialist through in my head against my will, the way you play things through when you know the answer but can't say it. 3 approaches: traction, lever rotation, and probably the modified Hippocratic that most musculoskeletal specialists defaulted to when the first 2 didn't take. All 3 shared a fundamental assumption that the correct thing to do with a dislocated joint was to apply force to it. You pulled, you levered, you tractioned. The assumption was wrong. Not always in simple acute dislocations with low muscular involvement, the force approaches worked fine. But in a joint that had been out for this long, with a species whose surrounding musculature was as strong and contractile as the Vareth's, every application of force triggered a proportional defensive response, and the defensive response was stronger than the force. You were arguing with the body. The body always won. I changed the dressings on the kitchen worker's burned forearm and checked the healing progress. Good. No sign of infection. The tissue was granulating cleanly, and went on to the next patient. On the 3rd day, the physician from the capital arrived. He was, by all accounts, everything that had been said about him. Elderly, distinguished in the way that expertise renders people distinguished, not by presentation, but by a quality of focused attention, refined over decades into something quiet and sharp. He was shown to the Queen's private receiving chamber with full ceremony. He was in the room for 3 hours. He left looking shaken in a way that senior physicians rarely permit themselves to look in institutional settings. I was in the small supply room at the end of the infirmary's west corridor when I heard the muffled sound of the Queen through the walls. The supply room shared its west wall with a storage corridor that backed against the residential wing's service passage, and sound traveled through the palace's older construction in ways its architects had probably not intended. I had first noticed this on my 3rd night, when I was taking inventory and heard 2 attendants having a quiet argument somewhere in the service passage. I had filed it as building-specific information and not thought about it again until now. I was not listening deliberately, but the sound came through anyway. It was not a scream. The Queen was, I had understood by now, a person of considerable self-possession, and the 3 days she had spent in significant pain had not altered that self-possession in ways that manifested audibly. What came through the supply room wall was quieter than a scream, and more sustained, and it was the kind of sound I knew from field clinics and hospice corridors. The sound that a person makes when the thing they have been managing has been made suddenly worse, when the body's tolerance for sustained pain is overwhelmed by a new input, and the defense fails for a moment before the self-possession reasserts itself. It was a very short sound, maybe 2 seconds. I sat down on the supply room step and counted the instrument packs in front of me and kept my hands very still and did not move until the sound had stopped, and the silence that followed it had lasted long enough that I was sure it was finished. Then I stood up and went back to work. 7 specialists, I had been keeping count. Droveth, who was the finest physician on the palace's permanent staff and who had studied at the Varathsel Collegium and 2 other institutions before that, and who had, I knew from the supply records, ordered a complete suite of the most advanced diagnostic imaging available in the past 3 days, and had presumably used that imaging to inform all of his approaches. 2 other staff physicians, neither of whom I knew well but both of whom had full clinical credentials and significant experience. The Collegium bone setter, 2 sessions, 3 approaches. The previous afternoon's consultant whose approach Perth had described with a tight face. The capital physician, who had just spent 3 hours in the room. 7 specialists, 3 days, the shoulder was still out. I was 11 days from the end of my contract. I completed the supply room inventory. I checked the overnight fluid logs from the recovery ward and found the same documentation discrepancy I had been finding and correcting for the past week. A different junior staff member each time, all using the same incorrect abbreviation, which told me the problem was a training gap rather than individual error and would need a procedure update. I added a note to the quality log, which nobody had responded to yet but which I added to anyway, because the quality log existed for exactly this kind of observation, and because ignoring a systematic problem because nobody was responding was not how you ran an infirmary. I did my rounds. I went back to my quarters. I lay on my back in the dark with my eyes open and looked at the ceiling of my small room, which was not vaulted and had no carved patterns that I could see, and I let myself think about it properly. Not the sideways thinking, but the direct kind, the kind that doesn't pretend there is nothing to think about. The vareth glenohumeral anatomy, the shallower socket, the longer superior rim, the stronger surrounding musculature, the contractile defense response, proportional to the applied force. The 3-day timeline. By now the surrounding musculature would have undergone some degree of adaptive shortening, not severe, but enough to add resistance to any approach that relied on the muscle releasing on its own. The standard force approaches, traction, lever rotation, Hippocratic were all working against that contractile response, and the response was winning. The approach that did not work against the contractile response was the one that worked with the exhalation. The one that used the moment of maximum respiratory muscle relaxation. The moment when every skeletal muscle in the body releases fractionally following the exhale, because the respiratory and skeletal muscles share a neurological pattern, and the body at full exhale briefly and involuntarily softens. To make the one small rolling motion, the joint was already capable of, if the surrounding musculature could be convinced to allow it. You couldn't force it. You had to wait for the body to open the door. The exhale was the door. I had used this technique 30 or 40 times. I had been shown it by a field surgeon on my 4th posting, who had learned it from a military manual describing a modification used by field medics without sedation, because sedation requires equipment and time and a stable environment, and field medics often have none of those. The modification was not in any standard text I knew of. It was clinical knowledge passed from person to person in field settings, never quite making it into the formal literature, because the formal literature is written by people in institutions. I lay in the dark and thought about the Varath shoulder musculature, and whether the exhale principle transferred to a species with a different respiratory pattern and a different skeletal muscle architecture, and I concluded, working through the anatomy carefully, the way you work through a problem when you can't ask anyone that it did. The neurological link between respiratory and skeletal muscle was not a human-specific thing. It was older than humans. It was older than most things. I thought about what I would do if I were asked. No one was going to ask. I knew that, and I sat with it, and the sitting with it was not bitter exactly, but it was not comfortable either. I had learned to be comfortable being invisible. I had not entirely learned to be comfortable watching something go wrong in a building I was working in, when I knew the answer and had no standing to give it. I fell asleep eventually and woke to my alarm and went to do my shift, and the shoulder was still out, and I was still not asked. The fourth night, I was on the infirmary corridor at the second bell past midnight, writing up the overnight monitoring log at the duty station near the corridor junction. The night was quiet and complete in the way that palace nights were quiet. Not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of a large populated space in which the population had agreed to be still. The infirmary had 3 patients in the recovery ward: the kitchen worker, whose burn was healing cleanly, a young courtier with a post-procedure respiratory issue that was resolving on its own at the expected rate, and an elderly household administrator who had been admitted that afternoon with joint inflammation in the lower limbs and was responding to the treatment the physicians had prescribed. None of them needed active attention at this hour. I was doing the documentation because documentation was the thing that could always be done, the thing that was always there, the thing that kept the hands occupied and the mind focused, and that meant when something happened that required the mind to shift very suddenly from documentation to clinical assessment, the shift was clean and fast because the mind had been alert rather than wandering. I heard the footsteps before I saw the person they belonged to. Running footsteps, which were unusual in the palace at any hour and were very unusual at the second bell, and they were coming from the direction of the main corridor that connected the infirmary wing to the Queen's residential quarters. The sound of them on the marble floor was very clear, a rapid, slightly stumbling pace, not the controlled urgency of someone carrying formal news, but the genuine urgency of someone who has gone from standing still to running faster than they expected to need to. I put down my pen. The person who came around the corner was young, a courtier, male, Varath, pale blue-gray skin, and a formal robe slightly askew the way formal robes become askew when the person wearing them has been moving too fast for it to keep up. He stopped when he saw me. He looked at me with the flicker of reassessment I had become accustomed to, the expression that meant he had been hopping for one of the staff physicians, and was working out whether I was better or worse than the alternative, which was no one. "Is there a physician on the corridor?" he said. "No," I said, "there's me." He was breathing hard. He looked back over his shoulder at the way he had come, then back at me. He was trying to decide something and deciding it quickly, because there was no time for the slow version. "Droveth has retired for the night," he said. "The second physician is off-site. There was a family matter. He left before the evening bell. The others," he paused. "There is no physician available at this hour. The Queen," he stopped, started again. "The Queen cannot sleep. The pain is significant. She has taken the maximum dose of the sedative preparation they prescribed, and it is not sufficient." He was watching me carefully, the way people watch you when they are telling you something that depends on your response being the right one. "There is no one else." I looked at him for a moment. "You are the nurse," he said. "The human, you're on the night roster." "Yes," I said. "Sela Vorne, I'm the auxiliary night nurse on the contract roster." He held my gaze. The calculation he was running was visible in his face, and I did not look away from it because looking away from it would have been the wrong signal. He needed to see that I was not uncertain. I was not uncertain. I had been thinking about this for 3 days. "Can you?" he started. "Show me," I said, and picked up my kit bag from under the duty station desk, and that was that. The Queen's private receiving chamber was smaller than I had imagined from the outside of the residential wing. It was still a large room, high ceilings, pale marble, narrow windows along the south wall dark with the middle of the night, but there was an intimacy to the scale that I hadn't expected. The furniture was placed for use rather than display. There were books on the shelves in two of the alcoves, not arranged by height or color, but by what looked like order of reading, some of them lying flat, some with things tucked between their pages. The desk was worked in, there were papers on it, weighted at the corners, covered in what I assumed was the Queen's hand. The room had the feeling of a place where someone actually lived, which should not have surprised me, and did anyway, slightly. I had not thought through the obvious fact that behind the ceremonial figure I had seen in the corridor was a person with a study and a reading habit, and a desk that looked like that. The Queen was seated in a high-backed chair near the center of the room, not at the desk, not in the resting alcove to the left, which had cushions and a low table and looked designed for comfort. She had tried both of those positions, I understood, and found neither tolerable. She was in a sleep robe rather than formal clothing, deep blue, simply cut, and her hair was down, which changed the architecture of her face in a way that made her look somewhat less like the formal figure from the corridor, and somewhat more like a person who had been awake for a very long time and was very tired. Her right arm was held at a fixed angle slightly away from her body. The angle was the one I had been picturing in my head for 3 days. I recognized it the way you recognize something you have been expecting, with a quality of arrival rather than surprise. She looked up when we came in. Her gray eyes moved first to the young courtier, then to me. The look lasted longer than the one she had given me in the corridor on my 19th day, and it contained different information. Something like assessment. Something like the specific tiredness of a person who has received 7 rounds of expert attention and has been made somewhat worse by each one, and is not sure what to do with one more person walking through the door. There was a minister in the room as well. I registered him at the edge of my vision, standing near the south window wall, tall, gray-silver skinned, with the composed quality of someone who had been standing in that position for some time and intended to remain in it. I would learn later that he was Laurie's Oville, the Queen's chief minister, and that he had been present for at least 3 of the failed reduction attempts, attending as a witness and apparently saying nothing. At this moment, I registered him as a witness and a presence that needed to be accounted for in the room's energy, and returned my attention to the Queen. "Your Majesty," I said. I crossed the room at a normal pace, not hurried, not tentative. "I'm Sela Vorne. I'm the auxiliary night nurse. I've been asked to come and see if I can help." I pulled a chair from near the wall and set it in front of her, not at the respectful ceremonial distance, at the distance from which I could reach her, which was close enough that she would have to decide whether she was going to tolerate my proximity, and I watched her make that decision, and she did. I sat down. "May I look at the arm?" I said, indicating with my eyes rather than touching. A long pause, then a very slight incline of the head, which in Vareth court register meant yes rather than the small bow it looked like in human idiom. I started with the hand, not with the shoulder. That was the mistake, the assumption that the shoulder was the thing to address first. I started with the hand, my fingers very light, checking circulation in the digits, checking the temperature gradient between the fingertips and the palm. Then the wrist, the same gentle assessment. The forearm, the elbow, each step slow enough to register as non-threatening, light enough that it read as contact rather than examination. I was gathering information, and I was also letting the body understand that the touch was not going to hurt, which was an important thing to establish because the body in chronic pain is braced against touch in a preemptive way that makes every subsequent assessment more difficult. By the time my hand came to rest very lightly on the upper arm just below the shoulder, the Queen had gone very still. Not the stillness of bracing, the other kind. The stillness that the body adopts when it has registered that what is happening is not an immediate threat, and the defensive response can modulate slightly. "Tell me what happens," I said, "when you try to lower it." She spoke in standard register, low and measured. "The muscle here," she indicated with her left hand, touching the interior of the shoulder joint contracts very suddenly, and then everything tightens around it. I've found that if I anticipate the contraction, I can control it somewhat, but I cannot prevent it, and a very small pause. It hurts considerably. Yes, I said. What you're describing is exactly right. The muscle is contracting because it is protecting the joint from further movement. It doesn't distinguish between the movement that caused the injury and movement that would correct it. It treats all movement as threat. I kept my voice neutral and explanatory, not reassuring. Reassurance said you don't have to worry, and that wasn't true, and she would know it wasn't true. Explanation said here is what is actually happening, and that was a different thing and a more useful one. The approaches you've had attempted so far have all worked against that contraction. They applied force, and the muscle responded to the force with more force, and the joint didn't move. She was watching me carefully. The gray eyes with their edgeluminescence were attentive in a way that was slightly different from the assessment I had seen when I first came in. Something was shifting in it. What every physician told me, she said, was to relax. Yes, I said, that instruction doesn't work. You can't consciously relax a muscle that is contracting in response to pain. It's not a voluntary system. Telling a patient to relax in that context is like telling them to stop having a reflex. I paused. What I'm going to try is different. I'm not going to ask you to relax anything. I'm going to ask you to do something very specific at a specific moment, and your body will do the rest. Quiet. All right, she said. I'm going to move your arm to a different position, I said. I'll go slowly and I'll stop if you tell me to. The position I'm aiming for is not a comfortable one, but it will be no more uncomfortable than where we are now. Once I have you there, I'm going to ask you to take a breath in and then let it out, just a normal breath, not a deep one. In the moment that you let it out, I'm going to make one small movement. It won't be large. You may feel something shift. You may hear a sound. Both are normal, and both are what we want. She looked at me for a long moment. 3 seconds, she said. I realized, with a small internal adjustment, that she had been listening very carefully and had heard the implied timeline in what I said. About that, I said, once we're in position. Then do it, she said, not impatiently, with the directness of someone who has run out of reasons to approach things indirectly. I moved her arm. The motion took patience. I guided by the elbow rather than the shoulder, keeping the upper arm in neutral rotation, working against gravity rather than with it in the early part of the movement, because working with gravity in the early stages would have added unwanted torque to the joint. The queen held very still. The protective muscle contracted once, hard, early in the movement. I felt it through the fabric of her robe, the sudden rigidity of the surrounding tissue, and I stopped completely, held the position. Waited. I did not pull against the contraction. I simply held where we were and let the contraction do what contractions do when they are not fought, which is exhaust the immediate trigger and reduce slightly. When it softened, maybe 10 seconds, maybe 15, I continued. 40 seconds to get the arm into position. The position, for the anatomy, neutral abduction of approximately 30 degrees, external rotation minimal, the forearm hanging in a line that let the weight of the limb apply gentle inferior traction without any active pulling on my part. In Varath anatomy, with the longer superior rim, the effective position was slightly different from what it would be in a human. The abduction was less, the external rotation closer to 0, and I had worked this out from the anatomy supplement across the past 3 nights in the way you work out a calculation before you need it. I let the arm rest there. I waited another 12 seconds, not rushing, letting the body register the new position, find its equilibrium, determine that this was not worse than what had come before. The protective response needed to believe that we had stopped threatening it before it would loosen at all. The queen was breathing very quietly. She was not fighting the position. She was, I thought, doing what she had said, thinking through it rather than reacting to it. Breathe in for me, I said, just normally, and when you're ready, let it go. A pause. She breathed in. She breathed out. At the precise moment of the exhale, the moment when the intercostal muscles release and the diaphragm rises and every skeletal muscle in the body softens fractionally in the shared neurological pattern of the exhale, I made the rotation. The forearm swept inward across the body's midline in one smooth arc, a motion that turns the humeral head, that rolls it medially and superiorly, that points it toward the glenoid cavity like a guide rather than a force. The ball found the cup. Not because I pushed it there. Because the cup was where it was going and the body's tolerance had opened, just briefly, just enough, and the ball went home. The queen made a sound. Short, sharp, involuntary and immediate, the kind of sound the body makes when something changes suddenly, before the mind has time to interpret whether the change is better or worse. The sound lasted approximately 1 second. Then silence. Not the silence of someone waiting for the next wave. The other silence. The one I had heard maybe 30 times in my career. Different each time. The same each time. The silence that follows the moment when the pain that has been constant for days simply stops, or steps back so far that it is indistinguishable from stopping, and the body does not yet know what to do with the vacancy. I kept my hand on her arm, not gripping, not applying any pressure. Just there, the same light contact that had been there throughout, so that the transition from what had just happened to the stillness that followed it was not a sudden removal of touch but a continuation. The queen breathed out slowly, once and then again. And her face changed. It changed in the specific way that faces change when what they have been holding against is gone. The lines around her eyes, which I had not consciously noted, and which I now understood had been there for 3 days, relaxed. The set of her jaw, which I had read as composure, as the cultivated composure of someone in public, and which I now understood had been at least partly the continual work of containing something, loosened. The luminescence at the edges of her gray irises was, in that moment, very clear. Whatever it signified in Varath physiology, it was present and complete. She looked at me. I want to be precise about what that look was and was not. It was not gratitude of the performed kind, the kind that has been waiting to be deployed. It was not the look of a superior acknowledging a service rendered. It was not even exactly the look of surprise, though there was something of surprise in it. It was the look of a person who has just had a fixed assumption proven wrong. Not a small assumption, a foundational one. The assumption that I knew what I was there and that what I was there was background, and the look was the process of that assumption adjusting, which is not a comfortable or comfortable-looking process, but which is, in my experience, one of the more honest things a face can do. "That's it," she said. "That's it," I said. A long beat. "The others," she started. "They were working against your body," I said. "The approach I used works with it. It's not better medicine. It's a different set of assumptions about where the resistance comes from." I kept my voice level. I was not interested in dwelling on what the others had done. They had done what their training had given them, and their training was excellent and extensive, and the technique I had used was not in their training. That was the whole of it. You'll want to rest the shoulder for several days. I'll put a sling on before I go and leave you the aftercare instructions. She held my gaze for another moment, and then she said something that I did not expect. "What is your name?" she said. "Sela Vorne," I said. "I've been on the night roster for 3 weeks." She said nothing to that. What she did was look at me with an expression that I filed away carefully and did not interpret aloud. I fitted the sling before I left, a simple splint sling, properly positioned, with the arm supported at the angle that would prevent the shoulder from opening during sleep, and showed the young courtier the positioning check so that he could verify it hadn't shifted in the night. I left the written aftercare instructions on the side table in clear court register, with a translation in standard at the bottom, because if anyone read it in the morning who had not been in the room it would be Droveth, and I wanted Droveth to be able to read it without asking anyone for help. I acknowledged the minister near the window wall with a nod. He nodded back, which was a longer interaction than I had expected. I packed my kit bag. I walked back to the infirmary corridor. It was past the third bell. I had 2.5 hours left on my shift. I went back to the duty station. I sat down. I picked up my pen and opened the overnight monitoring log to the page I had left it at and continued writing. The handwriting was, I noted, exactly as regular as it had been before I left. The hands were steady. I had known, going in, what the outcome was likely to be, and preparation makes for a steady hand. The work was the work. You assessed, you used what you knew, the joint went home or it didn't, and you documented it either way. It had gone home. I wrote that in the notes in language that was technically correct and appropriately modest. Assisted manual reduction, vareth glenohumeral joint, right shoulder. Reduction achieved. Patient instructed in aftercare. Sling applied and positioning verified. I signed it with my name and my credentials and the time, and that was the clinical record. When the day shift came on at the morning bell, I handed over clean, documented, complete. I walked back to my quarters. I ate something. I sat on the edge of the bed for a moment. Then I reached up to the shelf, where I kept the second bag, and took it down. I unzipped it. I took out what was inside, item by item, and put it in the storage unit's spare uniforms, the annotated anatomy supplement, the photograph I had carried from posting to posting, face down in the bag because face up would have been too much and face down was a manageable compromise. I set the photograph face up on the surface beside the bed. I closed the empty bag and put it on the high shelf and climbed under the covers and went asleep. Larry's Oval came to the infirmary wing at mid-morning, 2 days later. I had not been expecting him specifically. I had expected something, some communication, some formality, because the palace was a formal institution and formal institutions communicated through formal channels, and what had happened in the Queen's private receiving chamber at the third bell 2 days ago was the kind of event that would eventually require a formal response of some kind. I just hadn't known what kind or when. I was in the supply room taking the weekly inventory, a task I had begun doing because the supply records had been inaccurate when I arrived and had become accurate since I had started doing them systematically. And accurate supply records are the structural foundation of a functional infirmary, the way a foundation is the structural foundation of a building, in that everyone takes it for granted when it's right and notices it immediately when it isn't. I was halfway through the dressing supply count when I heard the step in the doorway and turned around. Ovel was in the plain deep blue ministerial robe. He stood in the doorway with his hands folded, and he waited until I turned, and when I did he looked at me with the same quality of composed attention he had directed at the window wall in the Queen's receiving room. "Nurse Vorne," he said. "Minister Ovel," I said. I had learned his name and position from the young courtier over the past 2 days, in the sideways manner of palace information. "I'd like to speak with you," he said, "when it is convenient." I looked around the supply room. Nothing in it was urgent. "Now is convenient," I said. He came a step further into the room, not fully in, just far enough to be inside the conversation. He folded his hands and looked at me directly. "The Queen is resting," he said. "She slept, the night before last and last night both. She has not slept in 3 days prior to that." "Good," I said. "The sling position." "I've read the aftercare instructions," he said. "They were very clear." I stopped. "I found them on the side table when I came to the room that morning," he said. "I read them carefully. So did Droveth." He let that sit for a moment. I let it sit. "I'll come to the point," he said. "The Queen has asked me to speak with you regarding your contract." "It has 9 days remaining," I said. "Yes, the palace would like to change that." I waited. "We would like to offer you a permanent appointment," he said. "The title would be palace nurse, a post that has not previously existed at this court, which explains why the formalities will take time to arrange. The position carries full scope of practice, defined by clinical judgment rather than rank hierarchy. not the limited auxiliary scope of your current contract. He paused. The salary would be substantially higher. You would also have access to the medical reference collection in the palace library, which is significant, and which would have been available to you from the beginning had anyone thought to make you aware of it. He said that last sentence without particular inflection, which was, I thought, a form of accountability. We should have reviewed your credentials before, he said. We did not. I stood with the inventory board in my hands and thought about it. Not about whether to do it. I had made that decision when I unpacked the second bag, which was perhaps optimistic, but which was also what it was. I thought about what the offer needed to contain in order to be what it said it was. One condition, I said. He waited. My scope of practice is determined by my clinical judgment, I said. Not by a job title, and not by whether the patient outranks me. If I identify a problem and I know how to address it, I address it. I'm not willing to spend another 3 days watching something go wrong in a building I'm working in because nobody thought to ask. A pause, the composed stillness held. That is acceptable, he said. The Queen has already given her view on this. She has. She said she would like the person who helped her to have the standing to help her in future. Those were her words. A very slight pause. I will add my own. It is also the correct arrangement from a practical standpoint, regardless of the circumstances that prompted it. A nurse restricted from practicing what they know is a liability, not an asset. We should have understood that before. I looked at him for a moment. Then yes, I said, I'll stay. He nodded once. He turned to go and then turned back. The approach you used, he said, not as a question. Droveth has indicated he would like to understand it. He told me to convey that. Tell him to come to the infirmary, I said. I'll show him. A week after that, I attended a brief ceremony in the small audience hall. I had been given an hour's notice, which was enough to change into the correct uniform, and not enough to think about it in any useful depth, which I thought was probably intentional on the part of whoever had arranged the timing. The small audience hall was, in the Varathsel sense of small, a room that held perhaps 30 people comfortably, and held them now, ministers, senior household staff, 2 of the palace physicians, several senior courtiers who I recognized from their habit of needing medical attention at inconvenient hours. The Queen was standing near the center of the hall. I registered that immediately and correctly. She was bearing weight on both feet, her posture unrestricted, her right arm in a partial sling position but no longer at the fixed defensive angle. 7 days out from the reduction, that was correct and good. The musculature was recovering on its schedule. She was in her full formal clothing and her hair was in the arranged pinned style, and she looked, I will not pretend otherwise, like exactly what she was, which was the governing authority of this house and this territory, in her formal setting, with the pale marble and the amber light and the assembled court around her. She was the visual and institutional center of the room in every sense. She looked across the hall at me when I came in. Directly, without the scanning movement that a look across a room usually involves when you are locating a person. She looked immediately to where I was, as though she had known exactly where the door was and exactly where I would be standing when it opened. She crossed the hall. The room went quiet in the specifically complete way that rooms go quiet when the person everyone is watching moves with purpose. She stopped in front of me. Up close, the luminescence at the edges of her irises was visible in the way it was in a quiet room with good light, clear and steady. I know your name, she said, quiet, immediate, not a performance, not an opening to a speech, a statement addressed to me in my hearing. Sela Vorne. Yes, I said. I didn't, she said, before. I held her gaze. I know, I said. It was a strange thing to say to a queen in a formal ceremony with 30 people in the room, but she had said a true thing, and the answer to a true thing is not a gracious deflection. The gracious deflection would have been a kind of lie, A small one, an easy one, but a lie nonetheless, and I did not think she had crossed the hall to hear a lie told graciously. She had told me what was true. I told her what was true in return. The corner of her mouth moved. I recognized it now, the specific small movement that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to it, the expression that lived just inside the formal composure. I had seen it the night of the reduction, in the receiving room, when she had asked if that was really it. It was the expression of someone being surprised into something genuine. I wanted to do this properly, she said, which was not a formal statement but the explanation behind one. The explanation that a person gives when they have decided that the person in front of them can receive it. Then she turned, and there was the formal portion. Oval said several sentences in the court register. The appropriate formal gestures were made. The appointment was confirmed in the official record. It was all appropriately brief. And then it was done, and the hall began to disperse with the specific quality of dispersal that follows ceremonies. People moving back toward their own work and their own thoughts, the 30 people becoming 30 individuals again. I stood where I was. Droveth passed me on his way to the door. He paused. He did not quite look at me, and then he did. "The approach you used," he said. "The exhalation timing. I would like to understand the mechanics of it." His tone was not easy. His face was not easy. He was a person of considerable expertise and reputation, and the past week had been hard on both, and he was standing in a formal hall asking to be taught something by a human auxiliary nurse on a contract roster. I thought he was doing it anyway because he was, whatever else he was, a physician who cared about the outcome. The outcome of the past week had made clear there was a gap in what he knew. "Come to the infirmary in the morning," I said. "I'll show you with a model first, then we can discuss the Varath-specific modifications." He nodded, once short, and went. I have been at Varath's cell for a year now. I can tell you what the carved patterns on the ceiling of the main infirmary hall are, because I finally asked, 5 months in the way that I learned most things at this court, by asking Perth, who knew someone who knew. They are a continuous text, a record of the founding of the infirmary, rendered in a script so old that most Varath needs specialist training to read it. The pattern I couldn't make out from floor level, looking up while I restocked shelves on my night shifts, was sentences. The palace had been writing history over my head the entire time I worked there before I knew my place in it. I think about that sometimes. The second bag lives in the storage unit. The photograph is on the surface beside the bed, face up. The annotated anatomy supplement lives on the shelf beside the reference text from the palace library, which is, as Oval indicated, significant. It holds anatomical literature on 43 species, cross-referenced by system and sorted by original author, and I have been working through it one volume at a time on evenings when the infirmary is quiet. The Varath-specific volumes are better than anything I had access to before. I have learned things about the species I treat that I should have been able to learn anywhere and couldn't, because the literature exists and the access is what is unevenly distributed. I walk the infirmary corridor on the afternoon shift now, and I know every supply location and which way the autoclave cycles and the name of every member of the kitchen staff. Perth and I have standing arrangements about the morning water delivery that have evolved into something functioning as a daily briefing on the state of the palace. She tells me what she knows. I sometimes tell her things that are useful from a health standpoint. It is not an official arrangement. It is what happens when two people who work in the same building and have both been invisible for most of their careers recognize the situation in each other. Droveth came to the infirmary the morning after the ceremony, and I showed him the technique on a model, then walked through the anatomy and neurological principle with him for about 2 hours at the reference table. He asked good questions, pointed, specific, technically precise, the kind that tell you someone is genuinely trying to understand the mechanism rather than simply acquiring the steps. I answered them. By the end of the session, I had the sense we were at the beginning of a different kind of professional relationship, than the one that had existed before, which was one that had not really existed at all. He has been back 6 times since. On the 3rd visit, he mentioned that the documentation procedure update I had added to the quality log in my 3rd week had been implemented across the infirmary ward staff. He said it as a matter of clinical record, which it was, and I received it the same way. 3 days ago, the Queen came through the infirmary corridor on the way to the residential wing. She was moving at a pace that was not stopping a working pace, the pace of someone with somewhere to be. 3 attendants and a minister. Normal protocol. She saw me at the duty station. She said in passing, "Vorne." "Your Majesty," I said. And she kept walking because she had somewhere to be, and that was all. I have thought about what that is in the year since the receiving room, what it means when someone who looked through you begins to see you. The answer I have arrived at is that it is not a dramatic thing and does not need to be. What it is the correct state of affairs, established and maintained. It means that when she comes through the corridor, I am not an obstacle successfully avoided. I am a person who works here, who knows what she is doing, who would be sent for if something happened that required what I know. That is the whole of it. That is what I came to Varath Cell for, though I didn't know it when I arrived. The marble floor catches the amber light in the late afternoon. The vaulted ceiling holds its old sentences that the palace had been writing all along. The infirmary is quiet, and the corridor is mine, and I have unpacked both bags, and I am not going anywhere. It was enough before anyone knew my name. It is enough now that someone does. It is, I think, always what it was. The work done right in the building where you know where everything is, by the person the building finally knows how to find.